Good afternoon. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd like to welcome everybody for joining our book talk today. It's fantastic to see so many people coming in and just enjoying our authors and talking about the work that they do. Before we get started, though, I would like to say that this event is sponsored by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, with support for the foundation in memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family, and also thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programming, not just our book talks, but our trivia nights, our drink and draws, our curator conversations, all the great virtual programs that we put on here at the museum. Our author and guest today is Gwen Strauss. Gwen is an American author living in France, and she is currently the director of the Artist Residence Program at the Dora Maar House in Mena. I hope I said that right.
Perfect.
She is the author of 5 books, including Ruth and the Green Book, 6 anthologies, numerous short essays and fiction, and her latest book, which she's going to talk to us about today, is The Nine. And this is a true story of a group of women who have survived, or who did survive, the worst of Nazi Germany. Gwen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. So thank you, everyone. I feel really honored to speak with you. And thank you for showing up at noon at the beginning of the week to listen to me talk. What I thought I would do is I'm going to do a PowerPoint of about 30 minutes, maybe 32 minutes. And then we can just have a conversation. You can ask me questions. So I'm going to share my screen. And
as you're bringing that up, Gwen, I'm just going to remind everybody that if you do have any questions for our author today, please submit those via the chat function right here on Zoom. I'll be taking all those questions, putting them into our PowerPoint, and bringing those up at the end of the presentation so everybody can see. So please, if you do have any questions for Gwen today, please do submit that through the chat function. Gwen, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So the book that I wrote is called The Nine, and what I thought I would talk about today for this introduction to it is sort of how I came to this story, because it was unlike any other book I'd done before, and sort of the research is sort of like the making of rather than the book itself, and maybe it'll spark your interest enough to buy the book. So the book really began with this woman. This is my great aunt, Hélène Podliasky. One day at lunch, with my grandmother, in 2002, she told me this sort of amazing story about how she had been arrested by the Gestapo and deported to Germany, but then how she had escaped with a group of women from Germany and traveled across the front lines of the war looking for the US troops. I was so surprised because I had never heard the story. I knew that she had been in the Resistance. I knew that she had like a, Croix de Guerre, and she was decorated, but I didn't actually know that she'd been deported. I didn't know she'd been in a concentration camp, and I certainly didn't know that she had escaped from one. And I don't think many people in my family knew it either. She probably had told my grandmother and maybe my uncle, her husband, my great uncle, but it wasn't a story she told. And so suddenly at 83, she was telling the story that had happened to her 60 years earlier. And so I asked her if I could come back and record it. She agreed, and I did that. We made a recording, and then that was it. We made a transcript. She corrected the transcript, and I think she gave the transcript to an archive. And for me, that was kind of done, though the story did continue in my head because it was so amazing. And then 2 years later, I came across this book, which is 9 Young Girls Who Don't Want to Die, written by this woman named Suzanne Maudet. And I read it, and it seemed so much like the exact same story that Hélène had told me that I wondered if this couldn't be the same story, one of the women in the group. My tante Hélène, when she told me the story, she couldn't remember how many women there were. She didn't tell me any of the names of the other women. In a way, because, 60 years and she hadn't spoken of it, her memory was quite vague. And suddenly there was this book by Suzanne Maudet. I showed it to Hélène. She read it, and she said, indeed, it was the same group, that Suzanne was Zaza, her friend from high school. They had found each other in Ravensbrück. And this was the same story. And in the book, she is the person that's called Christine. And I would find out later that Christine was her sort of nom de guerre, was like her code name. And that was the name that most of these women knew her by. So Zaza wrote her account of this escape really immediately after the war. I think it was in 1946 or 47. And and she tried to get it published. It was rejected everywhere. The manuscript was something that the family read amongst themselves. And then 20 years after her death in 2004, her nephew, or it's really her great nephew, was able to get the book published. And the book really covers just the story of the escape. It doesn't talk about anything in the past, like who are these women, why are they there, what did they do in the resistance, nor does it talk about the camps, nor does it talk about the future. It's really a small moment in time, and it's quite optimistic and almost like a recounting of almost like a, I don't know, like a camping trip. It really has a strange voice, but lively. Anyway, from Zaza's book, I learned that there were 9 women. I learned the nicknames of the 9 women, and I learned that 6 of them were French, and 2 were Dutch, and 1 was Spanish. And I also learned that they were all really young. They were between the ages of 20 and 29. And, fast forward several years, I thought, the story kept going around in my head. But around 2016, 2017, my daughter, Sophie, I have 3 children, but my oldest daughter was the same age as Hélène had been when she had joined the resistance at the age of 23. And we had this idea, why don't we go and try to retrace the escape route in Germany. Actually, Sophie, me and my children are German, though we've spent almost no time in Germany. We're German because my grandfather was a German Jew who escaped, and then I later got our citizenship so that we could live and work in Europe. And we live and work in France. But so this was a kind of an opportunity for us to go there. And for Sophie and I, was the first time we'd ever been to a concentration camp. We went to Buchenwald because we mistakenly thought that's where they had been. When I think about that first trip, I realized how many things I didn't know and how kind of blind I was flying. But the first time at a concentration camp was really powerful, moving. I would often say life-changing even. I'm not being hyperbolic. It was really a huge moment for me, and I think for my daughter. And it was also kind of when I realized, oh, this isn't just a little story. This is a much bigger story, and I need to know more, and I need to find out more. So at this point, I knew the names from Zaza's book. I knew Christine was Hélène, and I knew Zaza was Suzanne, and I knew there were 2 Dutch women named Lon and Gigi, and I knew there was Nicole, Mena, Jackie, Zinka, and the Spanish one named José. We also went to Leipzig because I knew from Hélène's account that they had been sent from the concentration camp to a Nazi slave labor camp, like a commando, they were called. This is like 1944. The Germans really needed to build their armaments, and they were using all this slave labor to do that. And these women were chosen to go to Leipzig. It was a satellite camp of Buchenwald, which is why I think they said that they had been to Buchenwald. This is sort of where the women spent the most of their time, over 9 months, in Leipzig. And this is kind of where the strongest friendships were formed, and this kind of acts of solidarity that I've learned later were just amazing. And what's also interesting about Leipzig, Hassag, is that these German industries, they would pay for this labor, this free labor, the slave labor. They would pay the SS. Of course, they wouldn't pay the workers. And women were cheaper, and women lived longer. So the lifespan, the average lifespan of a man in a Hassag Leipzig factory was 3 to 6 months. And for women, it was 9 months. And by the time that these women would make their escape, they would have already been there for over 9 months. They were in Leipzig building at this armament factory, making Panzerfaust, these rocket-held grenade launchers. They were making the Obus, the grenade part. And it was, grueling work. It was 12 hours a day. They had quota of 7 tons per person. They were injured many times. Zaza crushed her fingers. But the part that's interesting for me about this is that, and the part that my tante Hélène told me, and actually when I look at the transcript, it's where she spent her most time talking, was that she was able to sabotage the making of these weapons. This was because Hélène spoke 5 languages fluently. She was a mathematician and an engineer. She was brilliant. And she spoke French and German and Russian and Polish and English. And she spoke Russian, Polish, English, Russian, Polish, and German without an accent. So she was able to talk to all the different prisoner groups and also the civilians. And she was quite beautiful, as you saw earlier. And she befriended the sort of foreman of the factory, a man named Fritz Stupitz. I think he fell in love with her. And he put her in charge of the thermostat for the forge, where they would forge these shells. And she was able to rewire the thermostat so that in the middle of the forge process, the temperature would go down, and then it would go back up before the end so that the shells would come out red hot, so nobody would notice something. But of course, they were poorly forged, and they would often, almost always, explode in the face of the soldier using them. So the factory was over and over again inspected because they couldn't figure out what was going wrong. Of course, they never suspected that starving women were capable of such sophisticated sabotage. So she was never caught. And the factory was also bombed quite often by the Allies because they knew it was a weapons factory. And it was finally destroyed in April of 1945, April 10 and 11. To go back, so from the archivists at the Leipzig Memorial, I got this Nazi prisoners list, and she sent it to me a few days later. So when we visited it, I gave her the name of my tante Hélène, I gave her the name Christine, which is actually how she found her, and the birth date and everything. And a few days later, she emailed me this list, which was a list of all the women who were in Hashtag Leipzig in August of 1944. And there was Hélène, and there was Zaza's name just above hers, Suzanne Maudet. And then Lon's Magdalena Verstenian, I figured out that was Lon because it's such a Dutch name. And then below was José Bordanova. I thought maybe this could be the Spanish one that we're looking for. And of course, there was Gigi up at the top. I don't know if you can see. So this was like, oh, there it is, Gigi Dandes. So now I suddenly had a few names and ideas of, you know, where I could look further. And, you know, I'm not a historian, but it was a kind of a discovery for me about these archives. And I then went back to Paris and went to the war archives. I looked for their war records, but really the National Archives were very important. That's a different archive. And in that archive, I found this archive of this woman named Odette Pilpol, who was in the same labor camp with them and even in the same block bunker, you know, dorm where they slept. And the story of this woman, Odette Pilpol, is a story all on its own, and it deserves its own book. But she was just this amazing archivist in the camps. Before, she was an incredible woman in the resistance, but in the camps, she was an amazing archivist. And what she did was when the factory was bombarded, she and everyone was then thrown out onto a death march, which I'm going to get to in a second. She stayed behind, hid, even though it was rumored that the whole camp was going to blow up and everyone who stayed behind was going to be killed, in order to sneak into the office and steal all the paperwork and the evidence. And she stole this list, which is over 300 pages, and which was life-changing for so many families looking for their lost daughters and wives and mothers. And she's the one that wrote Hélène. You can see Hélène written in pencil next to Christine. So she knew Hélène well enough to know her real name. And I just, just quickly that, Odette kept lists all the time. She was constantly writing lists of transports that arrived, and she had lists of who were the nice guards and who weren't the nice guards. She was an amazing record keeper, which is invaluable for history. And just on the far right, for example, what you see there is a map that she made. When the factory was bombarded, her friend Anne-Marie Popanon was killed. After everyone left, she and another few others buried her, and she made this map of where they buried her. And there was a draft in this archive of the letter that she wrote to her family, to say, this is where your daughter is buried, and this is where you can find her. So an amazing kind of woman. So when the factory was bombed, they threw them out onto a death march. I think many of you probably know, these death marches were kind of at the end of the war and these last couple months of the war, but they were the most deadly time for survivors. Over a third, I think it's 33% would die. That is estimate between 240,000 and 360,000, I think, died just during this time alone. So it was just, they of course, you have to understand, they've already not had, they've been on starvation rations. They've many injuries. In the group of 9, one had diphtheria, one had tuberculosis, one had a broken foot. I mean, they're really on, barely surviving. And then they were thrown onto the roads, sort of marched to another camp or another place with this crazy idea that Himmler had of getting all these laborers back and rebuilding the great German Empire. Or perhaps Himmler thought he could trade them. They were collateral. In any case, it was terrible. There were mass executions. There were, people just died on the road. And of course, the higher ups were deserting, and there was no food, and there was no water, and there was no really plan. So this is really the beginning of Zaza's book, is the night of the start of this march. And it's really clear to these women that they have only one choice, and that's to try to escape, because otherwise they will die. And in fact, they were right. The group that didn't escape was all shot in a field a few days later. Let me see, why can I go on to the next one? Oh, there we go. So, I was able at this point to sort of begin to understand their escape route. I knew that they had all been sent to Ravensbrück. That's the camp that was built only for women, concentration camp for women, just north of Berlin. From there, they were chosen and selected to go to Leipzig, where they were in this labor camp. They were put on the death march, where they marched for pretty much a day and a half nonstop. And somewhere near Oschatz, they escaped. And for the next 9 days, they travel across the front lines of the war. You can see this kind of zigzaggy line as they are desperate to try to find the American troops and not be found by the Russians. And, they're hungry, they're exhausted, to me, it was a little bit like the Odyssey. It's like a band of soldiers trying to find their way home at the end of a war. So at this point, I realized I needed to meet the families of the women that I knew, because I didn't know all 9 of them yet. And the first person I went to was Zaza's nephew, who was the one who got her book published. Sophie and I went together. We drove to La Rochelle to meet him. And that's Zaza older, as you see on his right. He's in the middle, the young guy in the middle. And then on the left is Zaza's husband, René Maudet, another survivor. So when I met Pierre, he was much older than he is in this photo. In this photo, he's like showing this incredible newfangled thing that he has, which is an electric typewriter, which he's going to type up Zaza's manuscript with. And they're all pleased by this fancy new thing. As I said, Zaza's book is really optimistic and cheerful. And so I thought she was the happy one, and she found her husband after the war. She was married before, and then she found René after. But what I learned from Pierre was that not at all, that in fact, she had a tragic afterwards with her 4 children. 3 of them committed suicide. And so when Pierre and I started to talk, he started to cry, talking about his cousins. And the conversation really became about transgenerational trauma. And he said, neither Zaza nor René ever really talked about it. In fact, you were not allowed to bring it up. If you did, she would just say, you can read the manuscript, that's all. René never talked about it. So there's this incredible silence and this incredible sadness that you sensed but couldn't touch. Ironically, or fittingly, when we went to meet Pierre, it was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and La Rochelle was covered with flags, and it was just interesting because, you think, okay, World War I really leads to World War II, and then you have all of this, trauma that keeps going and going. It was really, really moving. So then I was able to find Lon, the Dutch woman, Madeleine Verstenienne, because in 2010, 2 Dutch filmmakers had made this short documentary from Lon's point of view based on a book that she had written in 2009 called Unsnapt. I didn't find this out until I was doing this research a couple of years later. But what I did find out was that Hélène and Lon had met each other 65 years later, and it was filmed for this documentary film. And I have a link to that film on my website if anyone wants to see it. It's really quite beautiful. So Lon was one of the two Dutch ones. She had traveled to Paris with her friend Gigi to join her brother Eric, who was in the Dutch network of the resistance in Paris. But they walked right into a trap. The Dutch network was famously blown by a traitor, a double or even maybe triple agent. And when they arrived, you know, they were already marked, and several days later, the whole network was swept up. So they never really got a chance to join the resistance. So I found Gigi through a genealogical website. I didn't find Gigi, I'm sorry. I have to clarify. All of the women were dead by the time I started to work on researching this. So the only one I was ever to talk to in person was Hélène. But I found Gigi's family. And she also married another survivor. She married another Dutchman who she met on the bench outside of the Gestapo interrogation room as they were waiting to be tortured and interrogated. And he said, he promised himself that if he survived the war, he would find her and marry her. She didn't tell her children anything about what had happened. This is a theme that's pretty consistent in all of the women, but she did tell her grandchildren. And they told me that in summers when they would go and stay with her, she would tell them about the escape, almost like a cartoon. And so they were able to give me some of the things that she had said. Her family led me to Mena, who I never would have found because Mena his real name was Yvonne Guillou. She was a working class girl born in Brittany, had come to Paris to work in the factories. She said she joined the resistance for love. She wasn't political at all. She never talked about the war except to her daughter, and her daughter told her son. So it was her grandson who was able to tell me quite a bit. He told me that she had made a quilt for her daughter out of the coat that she wore during the escape, and then that she then later made a little teddy bear for him. She died quite young, as did his mother. What is interesting to me also about this, I just want to mention it. Mena comes from a really poor working class family. She becomes best friends with Gigi, who comes from an aristocratic, super wealthy Dutch family. Gigi is Protestant, Mena is Catholic. Hélène and another one in the group was Jewish. There were Gaullists, there were socialists, there were communists, there were not, apolitical. So this group is not at all coherent in any kind of ideology. They're just coherent in terms of friendship and solidarity. And I find that really quite powerful. So I did another trip to Germany because you can see I started to, getting excited about history. And this time I went with a group which is a kind of a nonprofit of friends of survivors of Dora and Buchenwald and the commandos. After the war, a lot of these survivors arrived back in Paris or in other places, and they realized, and it's actually really the women that do it first, that they need help. So they help each other. They created these groups called amicales, where they would find jobs for each other, they would find apartments for each other, they would help with money, clothes, and they would also help because many of them died in the first years afterwards of tuberculosis or whatever, they would stay with them as they were dying. And these groups then changed into descendants of victims. And then their mission became more to record and keep the witness testimonies and archives, and then really to maintain the camps as a memorial site. These groups fought to keep some of these memorials. You have to also remember that it's the Cold War right after the war, and some of these camps, like Buchenwald, are completely behind the Iron Curtain. Every year they go for the anniversary of the liberation of Buchenwald, and I went with this group, and on that group I met somebody who helped me contact another woman that I had now realized was in my group, a woman named Nicole Clarence, and she gave me unpublished writing, and I met her daughter, who gave me unpublished writings of her mother. And this is Nicole. Nicole was Jewish. She wrote an article about the escape in 1965 for Elle magazine, where she was an editor for the anniversary of the liberation. Interestingly, she got really nasty letters about doing that. And she was told that she should keep quiet and that it was not ladylike to do that, to write about such things. Nicole joined the resistance at the age of 20, and she was arrested the day after her 21st birthday. But by that time, she was in charge of all the agents de liaison of the whole Paris region. She had an incredible amount of responsibility, and she was arrested by the Gestapo and taken to a black site, which, believe it or not, the Gestapo had extra legal sites where they permitted worse things to happen. This site that she was taken to was infamous, Rue de la Pompe. It was run by a sadistic criminal gang. The tragedy for Nicole was that August 1944, Paris is about to be liberated. They can hear the bombs on the outskirts of the Allies coming. The French rail workers have stopped letting the trains go. Everyone assumes that they will be liberated and that there's no way they will be sent to Germany. But the Germans organize the last transport with German rail workers, and she is on that last transport. It's called the 57,000 because it's, I think there's only 1,000 people on the transport, but they would get that number when they arrive in Ravensbrück. It would start with 57. And it was really quite sad. They kept believing that at any moment it wouldn't happen, but in fact, they were sent into Germany and would spend the next almost year there. Nicole recorded for the UCH Shoah Foundation Visual Archive, the one by Steven Spielberg. She recorded 2.5 hours, which I found when I was doing this research, and it was incredibly invaluable for me. On that same last transport out of Paris was Jacqueline Aubery du Boulley. And the reason I figured out Nicole and Jackie was all the way back to Odette Pilpol, her archives. I figured out that they came on that transport. Jackie was a war widow. She's the oldest in the group. She's 29 at the time. She has diphtheria. After the war, she married a very famous resistance fighter named Charles Feld. And she never spoke of her deportation. When I spoke to her film editor, where she became a film editor. So when I spoke to her work colleagues and to her nephew, she never talked about it. They didn't even know, because Charles was the hero, and that's who they talked about. I'm going to go a little faster because I see him. It's a little time. José Bordanova was the Spaniard. She was the youngest of the group. She was 20 when she was arrested. She had a beautiful singing voice. They all talk about that. It's in many accounts. She was raised in foster care and in a foster home that was famous for hiding Jewish children, called the Marcel Group. The interesting thing about José is I know almost nothing about her, actually, except for her records and her war file, and also other people talking about her. But I was never able to I found a family member, but because José never spoke about it, and in fact, I think she denied that she was ever deported to a camp. When I talked to, I think it's a distant great niece, she said, no, that can't be that can't be, because that never happened to her. Even though it was the same José, the same birthday, the same parents, the same, birthplace, everything, but she just didn't believe me that they could possibly be the same person. On my final trip to Ravensbrück, to Germany, I finally went to Ravensbrück because that's where I realized these women, most of them had met. Most women who were deported to Germany passed through Ravensbrück or Auschwitz, but Ravensbrück was really the camp. It was a camp built for women. It's the second largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's 90 miles north of Berlin. It's so central to their story, and it's so central to the story of women in the war that I really felt I had to see it and I had to write about it. The history of the memorial is part of why we don't know so much about it. 3 years after the war, it was flattened. It's behind the Iron Curtain. It's in East Germany. And Ravensbrück became really marginalized. Like as many of the camps that were in the East, it was then a kind of a shrine of the struggle of the revolution against fascism, communism against fascism. There was no mention of Jews or gypsies or all the other asocials. Ironically, for example, there's a famous statue in front of Ravensbrück called the Tragende, which is a statue of a woman named Olga Banario carrying another woman. Olga Banario was a communist, but she was killed because she was Jewish, but that was not acknowledged. Many of the women who were in this camp and then went home did not speak of it. It was considered weirdly shameful. Like maybe they were prostitutes, or, who knows what they were doing. Were they sleeping with Germans? It was, marriages were called off. And so there was a kind of silence amongst many of the survivors of Ravensbrück afterwards. The final person that I discovered, and the last person I discovered, was Zinka. Zinka René Lebon had joined the resistance really early because her father was good friends with Charles de Gaulle. Her whole family was in the resistance. And she was arrested in 1943, but she was pregnant. She was just married and just pregnant. And the French at that point didn't deport a pregnant woman because the child was considered innocent. So that she gave the birth to the baby in prison in France in February of 1944. She named her baby girl France, and then she was deported. Zinka caught tuberculosis in the camps and suffered from it for the rest of her life. But from the beginning of this book project, I kept thinking, you know, France, Le Bon, has to be alive, or she could be alive. I mean, she was born in 1944. It's very possible that she's still alive. And it was kind of, I was trying to find her all the time. And there were many accounts of Zinka and how brave Zinka was and how Zinka talked all the time about her daughter and really wanted to survive for her daughter to have a mother. And even the group of 9 talked about getting back to France to find France, the baby. So I was amazed when I finally did find France. Here she is. I found her. She lives not that far away from me, maybe 4 hours away. Sophie and I went and visited her. And when I saw her, she and I both kind of fell into each other's arms, and she started to cry, and so did I. And I said, you won't believe how long I have been looking for you. And she said, well, imagine for me to learn all of this about my mother after 70 years. And what we realized talking that day together and over subsequent conversations was she had found her mother after the war, but her mother was ill and she often was raised by other families, and her mother never talked about what happened. And whenever she asked her mother would brush it away and say, oh, it was just a great time. It was all so fun or something. She would just really belittle it. So what France experienced was abandonment. She thought my mother left me just to go have fun. And when I was able to show her all of these accounts of how much her mother talked about her and how, in fact, she saved her mother's life because she didn't get deported until, 9 months later, it changed everything for her. And then she went up into her attic and she found a box of papers she hadn't had the courage to look through. And in those papers, sure enough, was an account of the escape that her mother had that she gave to me. So I just realized from this story with France how important it is to tell these stories. And, what I was sort of a theme, which I mentioned earlier, and I've mentioned, I think, several times, is that the women really kept quiet about their role in the resistance. After the war, de Gaulle asked the women to step back and let the men take the glory, he said, because the men had been so badly humiliated. And it should be enough that they got the right to vote in 1944. So he named 1,026 compagnons de la libération. These were the heroes of the liberation, of the resistance. And only 6 of them were women, and 4 of them were already dead, which is completely wrong. The resistance was hugely feminine for all kinds of reasons, which I can go into another time. But it's really kind of amazing how quiet the women were about what they did. But as they got older, and I think as they realized that they were going to be forgotten, but more importantly, they thought the people who had died would be forgotten. And also, I think there were some Holocaust deniers, and that spurred them to speak up. The women started to talk and started to tell their stories, often not to their own children, but to generations later. And so that's what the 9 is about. It's about the story of their resistance, what each of them did in the resistance, which is astonishing, how they befriended each other, what they did in the camps to help each other survive, why women survived longer than men in the camps, how they escaped together, how they got home, and then what happened to them after liberation, and why it took so long for them to tell their stories. So that's the 9 that I was, and that's it. That's my, should I stop the share and open it up?
Sure, if you'd like.
Okay, there we go. So
that's fantastic. When we got so many positive responses in the chat, just everybody saying how much they're looking forward to reading your book. There's already people sharing in there where to get the book locally. And you're right about the female resistance members. I was fortunate enough to meet 2 of them when I was studying in Paris. And just the fact that their stories are so undertold or not told at all. It is a shame, and so kudos to you for writing this book. It's fantastic work.
Thank you. Well, it's starting to be. I mean, I think there are starting to be more and more people writing fabulous books about these women, and there's some great books about it, like Marie-Madeleine Lafourcade. I really recommend the book about her. There's some, yeah. There's a lot of
And I
people
was
that,
also really pleased to see that some of your research came from the USC Show archives.
yeah,
I had the opportunity to go into those archives as well when I was at university, and what a treasure trove.
amazing,
It,
amazing.
and like you said, that one resistance member gave 2.5 hours, and there's thousands of people.
Right.
You could sort through that forever. And
Yeah,
there's just so much information. Such a great archive to be able to
yeah.
utilize.
And again, that was something that happened. I heard after Schindler's List, all of these survivors kept coming forward to Steven Spielberg saying, "I have a story," and he finally just said, "We have to just record them." And there's thousands. I think they're still doing them, but of course, as you know, there's very few survivors left. I mean, the time is running out.
I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions here. Let me share my screen real quick. The first question, Gwen, what was the hardest part about writing this book?
Well, partly, I really regretted that I didn't start sooner when the women were still alive, or at least some of the women were still alive. I could kick myself for that. There was just, a lost opportunity. I feel like I could have, and I should have asked Hélène, I should have interviewed her again. I should have gone back. Like, I just feel like it just frustrates me. So I really want to say to people, if you have these, elders, get their stories and ask the questions, because I think I was being polite by not asking. I would, asking my grandmother more, my grandfather more. I didn't do that, and so I regret that. And then, when I first started, I think I was very shy about contacting the families, and I also didn't know how archives worked. I didn't. I was very timid about the whole thing. So it took a while for me to build up my courage to, to say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to figure this out. It was detective work, which ended up being so much fun. But at the beginning, I was, I think I doubted myself.
I think that's why many of us historians get into this field, is because there's just so many questions out there. And the
Yeah.
more you start to research, the more
Yeah.
questions you come up with. And
Absolutely.
you're right, it is kind of like detective.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question.
Mhm.
Why do you think your Aunt Hélène kept this story to herself for so long?
That's sort of a great question. I mean, that is a great question, but that's sort of the, I think a lot of these women kept the stories to themselves because, first of all, they were not encouraged to tell them. And there was a kind of shame around them, people would think that they, what were they really doing? Maybe they were just, I think there was a lot like, maybe they were just prostitutes, these pretty young girls, they weren't taken seriously. So there was a kind of like, I think she preferred not to talk about it because she didn't want to be seen that way. And then I think she was protecting her daughter. She didn't want to lay a heavy, story on her daughter. I think that's true of all of the women. They felt like if they told their children, it would be too much for the children. So they were protecting them. And I think, yeah, so it was really interesting when she started to, why she chose me, because I wasn't that close to her. And I think that was part of it. I wasn't an immediate family member. I wasn't someone she felt somehow she had to protect. As you know, I was a writer. And I think she suffered from depression her whole life, and have several times had to be, go to an asylum, to a hospital and kind of get treatment for it. Like, so serious depression. And she had just had her third bout of that, and my uncle had died. And she said, if it happens again, I'm not going to get treatment, And I think she started finally to see a psychiatrist, it was sort of, and she was 83. So time was running out. So I think it's all of those things. And I would say something of that was almost true with almost every one of the women, except for maybe Nicole, who tried to speak of it right, 20 years afterwards, and was completely, if you read the letters that she got from other female survivors, just telling her, like, how dare you write about this, really, really shut down.
Yeah, and we hear that a lot too, from veterans from all different kinds of conflicts. but particularly with World War II. You know, they come home and they don't mention any of this. They keep it all to themselves. And it's not so much later on in life, or maybe even after they pass, that a family member or somebody with some sort of interest will find that story and be like, wow, you know, how come this was never told? And time and time again.
I also want to add that, you know, I think that this group of women, as you know, other groups that survived together, had a really strong sense of solidarity and friendship, like this intense experience that they went through together. Really, they almost died several times and they saved each other. And I think also there was feeling was that they would never have that again. There, you know, there's almost like a sadness that they could only talk about it with the other women in the group. They couldn't talk about it with anyone else. No one else would understand.
We had a late question come in through the chat, and one of our audience members wants to know, after the escape, one of the women noted that a German family that fed them seemed unaware of the concentration camp or the existence of the commandos. And she's curious, can you just comment further on the absence of awareness by the Germans, especially those who were living, you know, within a stone's throw of some of these places?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a really sticky one. Yes, there was a family that took them in, and Zaza at least believed that they didn't know that they were, at least the daughter was shocked to hear these stories. There were, of course, other families that took them in, or another family that clearly did know, and we took them in probably because the winds of war were going the other way, and they wanted to be sure to, you know, to be on the right side of things. You know, the more research I do on Germany and the Nazi regime, it's really important to understand that the German population was severely oppressed and paranoid and silenced and policed and terrified. You know, they couldn't really talk. They didn't really talk to each other. Everyone was denouncing each other. It was really not a nice place to be. So I think that some of the Germans maybe knew but didn't talk about it. You know, it certainly wasn't in the news or anything like that. You know, it wasn't something that would come up. You know, it was definitely, but it's hard to imagine. You know, these concentration camps were full of people that had to be fed. You know, there's a whole machinery behind it. Certainly, the German industries knew that they were there. The heads of German factories went and chose the women. So a lot of people didn't know and pretended not to know.
Yeah, and like you said, you know, even if you had a question, who could you ask? Who could you talk to and feel safe? You know, like you said, very difficult time.
Yeah.
Share screen back up.
Okay.
How does your work compare or differ from the book that you found on the escape? I believe it was Zaza's.
Yeah. So yeah, it's quite different. Zaza's book is great. I mean, it's interesting, I think. But it's really just the days of the escape. I think it's just those 7 to 9 days. And it's really kind of this positive, sweet story. She doesn't give us any background on any of the women. So my book really goes into each of the women. I find, you know, what they did, how they got arrested, what they were doing before, what family they came from, kind of the context. And I go a lot more into the camps. So Zaza doesn't even mention Ravensbrück or really anything in Leipzig. It's really just the time of the escape. It's like, this happened, we escaped. And this is how we, you know, so it was invaluable to me. I don't want to say it's not a great book, but it just is a much smaller story. And what I tried to write about was kind of the larger context. So what was it like to be a woman in a concentration camp and in a slave labor camp? And then what did they do in the resistance? And then why, you know, how did they help each other? Why did women survive longer? What were some of the ways that they survived and sabotage? You know, so I go much more into the whole context of that time and what it meant to be a woman then. I mean, almost in a weird way, Zaza's book is almost trying really hard not to say anything bad happened. There's a little teeny paragraph where she mentioned, you know, but mostly it's all good.
Gwen, do you plan to write any additional books about the other women that you came across in your research, like Odette?
Yeah, so I met somebody who's I think a descendant of Odette. I can't remember if it's a grandson or a nephew. I mean, he contacted me through internet. And I think they're going to write about her, which is great because she deserves a book. She's amazing, an incredible story in her, in fact, I wrote, there was about 100 pages that my editor cut out about Odette. The manuscript I turned in got very much cut down, which is good. I am working on another book right now about Ravensbrück. It's sort of a microhistory of Ravensbrück and about two women in the camp. It's a story I came across when I was researching this book. I have told myself this is the last time I'm going to do a concentration camp based book, at least for now, because it is hard. Actually, the earlier question that someone asked, what was the hardest thing? I should have said one of the things that was difficult was some of the research. At times is hard. So, but I'm enjoying, I'm trying to get this next book. I've written a draft of it and hopefully it'll be ready in a year or half a year or something like that. So
I can completely sympathize with that. My thesis in university was on resistance and concentration camps, and yeah, you can only read so much before it really does take a mental toll on you. Absolutely.
Yeah. And also I think part of the trick of writing about it is you don't want to just write all the horrors. You want to, show the other side of things, because we all, the horrors it just becomes then pure in details and doesn't really help. Of course, you need to write about it in a way so that people know, but then there's also, I feel like, I believe it, that there should be somewhat of a balance, because also in these camps and these places, great acts of courage and bravery and kindness and generosity happened, and those I feel like need to be highlighted and brought out and told as well.
And the friendships formed, and you're right. You do have to have that balance. And there are, I don't want to say good things that come out, but there are those more positive stories than just all the
completely beautiful stories that I've found in the research. And just every time you're just kind of like, wow, for example, just one of them, the women when they were in Leipzig, they formed this thing called the bowl of solidarity, the Gamelle de Solidarité. And they had a bowl that they would pass around every night. And every person who felt they could would put a spoonful of their soup into that bowl. Now you have to know they're already like barely have enough calories to survive. But they would create this bowl that they would then decide to give to the person who'd had the worst thing happen to them that day. And it would, would change. Maybe that day you found out that somebody had died, or maybe that day you'd been beaten by the Gestapo guy, or maybe, but they would do that every night. They would actually give away some of their food for someone who was, less well than they were. And this one woman named Juliette Best said something like, I'm gonna mess up the quote, but she said in her book, she wrote about it. She said, charity is giving when you can give, but solidarity is giving when you have nothing to give, which is really beautiful.
Yeah. Can you speak a bit more about the intergenerational trauma and what your research may have revealed about the effects on the younger generations?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I completely didn't know about this when I started to do this book. I had no idea it existed even. And it really highlighted my own family. So what is just super interesting about it is that you don't think the trauma passes, but it passes from generation to generation in all kinds of subtle ways. Often children of survivors, or more often grandchildren of survivors, will be in helping careers. They'll be, nurses or doctors or firemen or EMT. Often also the children will often be in careers with high adrenaline. So emergency room doctor, or because the family has this kind of sense that at any moment, there's a kind of sense that at any moment the worst thing can happen and you have to be prepared. And that's when they feel the best. It's sort of in the crisis. And it doesn't have to be spoken. It's just transmitted in all kinds of subtle ways. And it just made me think about how human history. Obviously, we have been traumatized over and over again, and we keep passing it down and passing it on. And kind of how do we heal generations and how do we heal ourselves is what I started to think about when I was talking to these families because they all have stories like this. I mean, I have to say that many of the children of these women didn't do so well. They had hard childhoods. Some of them are kind of borderline, you know, not, well, obviously Zaza's children are very sad stories, but the others as well. Yeah, it's really, really sad. It made me think about, you know, other generational traumas like that we have in the States, or things that haven't been acknowledged. You know, I don't know what the answer is. I do believe telling the stories is part of that. I think, you know, you can't heal it if you don't even know it. But I also understand why these women didn't talk about it. Like, I'm not saying like, oh, they should have immediately, you know, tell everybody, but the silence, I think, does cause the trauma to continue to be passed. What was really interesting for me, like what I was saying, so, you know, World War I, then leads to World War II. And then what happens a generation later is the 1968, the Cultural Revolution. And a lot of the kids of these women who said, yeah, I was a child of 68. I was a revolutionary. You know, they kind of basically, again, took on the mantle of their parents, you know, that next generation. So you kind of see this pattern. There were so many uncanny things. I remember Zinka had another child after the war who came and visited me with his son, and we went out to lunch, and he said, I'm anorexic and his son is a chef. So, and the reason he's anorexic is because Zinka was anorexic, and because after the war she was told that, you know, the children were never going to get enough nutrients because the women were so starved. And so she kind of had this whole regimen about how many calories a day he had to eat. And, you know, so he revolted and didn't want to eat at all. And then now he has a son who's trying to cook. It's just interesting. It's, you know, we're very interconnected. We're not as discrete and individualized as we think we are.
Yeah, agreed. I think I have one more question here for you. No, I don't. Sorry, that was it.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I do. There was another late question that came in. One of our audience members, she joined a little late, and she was curious that you did mention that one of the 9 was Jewish. The other 8, were they basically arrested for their resistance efforts?
I should have been clear about that. Yeah, so they were all arrested as resistance fighters, all of them, as political prisoners. Nicole and my tante Hélène were Jewish, but they kept that hidden. My tante Hélène was half Jewish and Nicole was fully Jewish, but they kept that hidden, and probably that helped them survive.
Oh, sure.
So as political prisoners, they had a little bit better status in the camp, and they were young women. They were in good shape, at least at the beginning. So they had all of these things that made their chances of survival better. But they were very much very much involved in the resistance. All of them doing different things. You know, José was hiding Jewish children. My tante Hélène was pretty high up, organizing this whole area and receiving packages from the British. Jackie was the second in command of a big network in near Lyon. As I said, Nicole was in charge of all the agents de liaison. Those were all the messengers that would connect the different networks. They all had, except for Guillou and Lon, who didn't get a chance to join, and Mena, who was she said she was just an agent de liaison. The rest of them had pretty important roles, I would say, in the resistance, and they had switched around. You know, they had. Some of them, like Jackie, started out in the south of France, and she got blown and moved up to Lyon, and then she had to move up to Paris, you know, so. And again, Jackie never told anyone about it, so it's really.
All the stories that we just will never hear about.
Yeah.
It's kind of frightening. At the same time, though, it's why we do what we do. And thank you so much for joining us today and for writing this book.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I love that.
And you can see all the comments coming up here. Everybody enjoyed the presentation, and like I said, I'm sure you're going to see your book sales maybe go up a bit.
Thank you.
Within the next week or so. But thank you so much, Gwen Strauss, joining us
Thank
from
you.
France. We appreciate your time. I'll say tonight because it's tonight for you.
Yeah.
And then for those of you who joined us in the audience today, thank you so much for taking your lunch hour, joining us for this wonderful book talk. We hope to see you on March 6th when we have Marv Truey, who's going to be joining us talking about his work on the USS Kitty Hawk riots in Vietnam. He was a JAG lawyer defending some of those Black men who were charged with rioting. And so I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what Marv has to say. But for now, Gwen, thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your Monday. And we'll hopefully see you next time.